You are a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your duty is far from over. Summoned into the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII, you're given a task so strange, so unsettling, that you question the limits of your own sanity. Before you stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina, her eyes red with grief. Through trembling lips, she delivers a request that freezes the very blood in your veins. With hesitant steps, you approach the great bed where Ferdinand's body lies, draped in silks that cannot disguise the dark truth of the man beneath. Even in death, the king who tormented Spain for 2 long decades seems to sneer at you from beyond the grave. But it is not his lifeless face that draws your gaze. It is what lies hidden beneath the sheets, an anatomical monstrosity that defined his reign as surely as his cruelty, his paranoia, and his betrayals. Historians would whisper of it for centuries, though never dare commit it to ink. Ferdinand's grotesquely oversized, unnaturally shaped endowment. It was both his deepest shame and his strangest pride, a secret that warped his private life as much as his rule over the kingdom. As you begin the grim work of preservation, your thoughts drift to the palace rumors, stories of specially designed cushions, of wives driven to tears, of desperate attempts to secure an heir, despite nature's cruel mockery. In this moment, you realize you're not merely preserving flesh and blood, but a grotesque symbol of a reign itself, deformed, excessive, and destructive to everything it touched. Before we unearth the forgotten tales of survival and suffering that haunted Ferdinand's shadow, I invite you, dear listener, to pause. If the hidden truths of history intrigue you, consider subscribing, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and letting me know where you're listening from. It's remarkable that across oceans and centuries, we are connected by a shared curiosity about the past. To understand Ferdinand VII, we must first understand the curse that shaped him. Not witchcraft, not divine wrath, but the poisoned legacy of royal inbreeding. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had bound themselves in cousin marriages and uncle-niece unions, weaving a tangled web of corrupted bloodlines. The result was a dynasty haunted by deformities of both body and mind. Ferdinand was born into this decaying lineage on October 14, 1784, at the Escorial Palace. He was the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, themselves first cousins, bound not by love, but by political arrangement. From the moment of his birth, the genetic lottery was stacked against him, and the price he paid would be one of profound humiliation. As the boy grew into adolescence, whispers among the court physicians grew louder. His body harbored a secret that defied medicine, a deformity so bizarre it inspired both horror and fascination. By his teenage years, the physician's notes, sealed away in Vatican archives, described an organ so massive, so twisted in form, it was beyond comprehension. One physician, in restrained tones, recorded, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimacy may prove impossible." Another was more blunt. "The prince's organ resembles a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its root, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological toll on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an age when classical ideals prized refinement and moderation, where even male anatomy was measured against statues of ancient Greece, his monstrous size marked him as a freak of nature. That which modern men might envy became, for Ferdinand, a lifelong curse. His childhood, already poisoned by neglect and dysfunction, became a crucible of shame. And from that crucible would emerge the man who would one day rule Spain, a man shaped not just by the corruption of his bloodline, but by the secret he carried Hidden beneath velvet robes and whispered through palace corridors, Ferdinand's childhood did not mold a king. Instead, it forged a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed, a man who preferred the chase of wild game to the burdens of ruling. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was infamous for her appetites, both political and personal, flaunting her open affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's true power behind the throne. The young prince witnessed this daily humiliation, learning early that betrayal was currency and that trust was weakness. But it was not only his parents' scandal that carved scars into his soul. It was the secret of his own body. The palace buzzed with whispers. Servants stifled laughter behind their hands. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Foreign envoys reported the Spanish embarrassment in coded dispatches back to their sovereigns. Ferdinand grew up with the crushing awareness that his most private self was a source of public mockery. The humiliation festered, rotting into resentment, until it defined the way he looked at the world. He began to see mockery in every bow from a subject, in every word of a tutor, in the painted smiles of potential brides. His paranoia was not entirely unjustified. People truly were laughing at him, but not always for the reasons he imagined. As adolescence took hold, his tutors noticed alarming changes. Ferdinand grew secretive, spiteful, and cruel. Servants who displeased him were dismissed, punished, or worse. The young prince had discovered a dangerous truth. While he could not control the monstrous deformity of his body, he could wield the power of his title to strike fear into others. One chilling episode, preserved in the memoirs of a palace chaplain, revealed the darkness hardening within him. A young page, unaware of the danger, accidentally entered Ferdinand's chambers while he was changing clothes. Instead of dismissing the boy, Ferdinand ordered him flogged. Worse still, the boy's entire family was banished from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one could glimpse the prince's shame and remain unpunished. As he reached marriageable age, the full scope of his condition became undeniable. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal physician, left secret notes that have survived in hidden archives. They describe, in chillingly clinical detail, an anatomy that defied natural proportion. His Majesty's member presents a most unusual configuration. At its base, no wider than a man's thumb, yet it swells to a circumference that defies human proportion. Its length approaches 10 inches in its natural state and grows considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is its curvature and the presence of additional tissue growths of no discernible function. Intimate relations are judged impossible without medical contrivance. The implications for Spain's future were catastrophic. A king incapable of producing heirs was a threat to dynastic stability. Thus, secret orders were issued. Royal craftsmen, sworn to silence, were commanded to create marital aids, intricate cushions, supports, and devices designed to allow Ferdinand to function as a husband without maiming his future wives. But the deformity was more than a physical problem. It consumed Ferdinand's mind. Obsessed with the idea of restoring his body, he turned to quacks, alchemists, and foreign physicians. They promised miracle cures, and he believed them all. Fortunes were spent on worthless elixirs, powdered pearls, crushed rhinoceros horn, rare herbs whispered to balance the royal essence. Some potions claimed to shrink the monstrous member. Others promised to restore fertility despite its twisted shape. All of them failed. Yet Ferdinand's desperation only made him more vulnerable. He became an easy mark for charlatans and opportunists who drained his coffers while feeding his paranoia. In 1802, the crown arranged his marriage. His bride was his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, a match decided long before they had even come of age. When the young princess arrived in Spain, she had no idea of the nightmare that awaited her. When Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily arrived in Madrid, she carried with her the bright romantic illusions of youth. She had heard her future husband whispered about as the desired one, a prince admired by many of his supporters. In her heart, she imagined herself stepping into a fairy tale, where she would marry a charming king and live a life of royal splendor. The wedding ceremony seemed to confirm her hopes. The cathedral rang with music. Golden light poured through stained glass, and the streets of Madrid erupted with cheers for the young couple. Maria Antonia looked radiant, intelligent, beautiful, and full of joy for the life ahead. Ferdinand, in public at least, played his part perfectly. He was attentive, polite, and even charming, appearing every bit the ideal royal husband. But weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign that something was wrong came not from Ferdinand himself, but from his valet. With an embarrassed formality, he approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting and requested unusual preparations for the royal bedchamber. Cushions of odd design, bottles of oils and salves, implements that seemed more medical than marital. All were brought in under the assurance that this was customary for royal couples. Maria Antonia was bewildered. Like most young brides of her time, she had been sheltered, her education rooted in religion, music, and etiquette. The facts of marriage had been explained to her only in vague and modest terms by older women who knew little themselves. She stepped into her bridal chamber with innocence, and what awaited her shattered it forever. When Ferdinand undressed before her, Maria Antonia's reaction was immediate and uncontrollable. She began to scream as though she had seen a demon step from the shadows. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, recalled her words. Her Majesty cried out, "Monster! Monster!" and pressed herself against the wall, pointing and sobbing, until we feared she had lost her mind entirely. What she beheld was no human form, as she had been led to expect. Witnesses described it as a grotesque club, thin at its root, grotesquely swollen at its end, twisted and deformed with unnatural growths along its length. Its very shape seemed alien, a violation of what she thought possible. That night was not a wedding night at all. It was a procedure. Ferdinand's personal physicians were summoned into the chamber to calm the hysterical bride and explain what arrangements would be required. The strange cushions were laid out, the oils applied, and the ordeal began. What followed resembled surgery more than lovemaking. Even with the medical aids, the act was so traumatic that Maria Antonia was dosed with laudanum just to endure it. For her, the experience left scars not only on her body, but on her soul. For Ferdinand, her terror cut deeper than any wound, fueling the paranoia and bitterness already festering in him. Their marriage became a ritual of despair. Month after month, the same grim ceremony repeated itself. Physicians would prepare the chamber. Maria Antonia would be given laudanum to dull her fear, and Ferdinand would attempt what nature had made nearly impossible. Afterwards, the two would retreat to separate wings of the palace, silent, broken, and ashamed. The failure to produce an heir hung like a shadow over the union. With every passing year, Ferdinand's desperation grew more fevered. He convinced himself that it was not his deformity, but his wife's revulsion that prevented conception. And in his search for a solution, his mind turned toward increasingly bizarre and dangerous experiments. As the years passed, Ferdinand's desperation twisted into cruelty. He became convinced that his wife's terror and resistance were the real obstacles to producing an heir. His solution was chilling. Court records reveal that he commissioned the creation of special restraints, leather and silk contraptions designed to hold Queen Maria Antonia in place during their encounters, preventing her from pulling away or crying out. These instruments of torment were made by the same artisans who crafted the king's saddles and hunting gear, turning the royal workshops into chambers of humiliation. But Ferdinand's obsession didn't end there. He turned to the heavens, seeking answers not in compassion, but in superstition. He consulted astrologers, astronomers, and men who dabbled in darker arts, timing his marital encounters according to the stars and lunar cycles. The palace became a stage for charlatans selling fertility charms, magical potions, and ritual ceremonies, each promising to break the curse of his deformed body. One particularly grotesque episode involved a wandering mystic who claimed to be from the Orient. He told Ferdinand that his grotesque anatomy was not a curse, but a mark of divine favor, a dragon's rod, blessed with hidden power. For 3 months, Ferdinand forced himself and Maria Antonia through bizarre rituals of incense, chanting and contorted positions said to come from ancient Chinese texts. Against all odds, Maria Antonia conceived. Twice. The court erupted in joy. Bells rang, and Spain dared to hope that salvation had come at last. Ferdinand walked taller, his confidence renewed. But hope quickly turned to despair. In 1804, at 4 months into her first pregnancy, Maria Antonia suffered a miscarriage. The physicians blamed her delicate constitution. What they meant, but dared not say, was that the trauma inflicted by Ferdinand's body had made it nearly impossible for her to carry a child to term. In 1805, she conceived again, carrying this child almost to full term. But the labor was a nightmare of blood and agony that nearly killed her. The baby was lost, and Maria Antonia's fragile body and spirit never recovered. From that day forward, she was little more than a ghost wandering the palace halls. Her dependence on laudanum deepened into addiction, numbing her pain but eroding what remained of her health. Ferdinand's response revealed the true depth of his cruelty. Instead of compassion, he turned on her with venomous accusations. He claimed she had secretly taken substances to prevent pregnancy, that she deliberately moved to cause miscarriages, even that she harbored dangerous liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to give Spain a Catholic heir. These whispers poisoned the palace, crushing what little was left of her sanity. Maria Antonia's final months were consumed by guilt and terror. She spent hours in frantic prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she could not name, convinced that she was cursed by God. In May of 1807, at only 21 years old, she died. The official records spoke of fever and weakness, but the truth was far darker. Maria Antonia died of despair, her body broken by trauma, her mind destroyed by abuse, and her soul consumed by hopelessness. Even in death, she found no peace. Rumors swirled that she had been poisoned, not by foreign enemies, but by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures and wanted to replace her with a bride, more capable of giving him an heir. These whispers grew louder when the palace apothecary, the one who prepared her laudanum, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Spain mourned its young queen, but behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. She had not died of illness. She had been destroyed by the monstrous marriage into which she had been trapped. Just days after Maria Antonia's death, the palace was shaken by another mysterious tragedy. The royal apothecary was found lifeless in his chambers. On his desk lay a letter, written in a trembling hand. But before anyone could read it, Ferdinand's agents seized it and locked it away forever. Whispers spread through the palace corridors. Some believed it contained a confession that he had administered poisons to the queen under Ferdinand's orders. Others claimed it revealed the truth about the king's monstrous anatomy and the impossible demands forced upon his young wife. Whatever the truth, it died with him. Ferdinand's own reaction to Maria Antonia's death was telling. In public, he displayed the proper grief, draped in black and seen weeping before altars. But behind closed doors, there was relief, almost eagerness. Within weeks, he was already inquiring about new brides, carefully seeking women who had already proven their fertility by bearing children in previous marriages. Meanwhile, his physicians worked with feverish urgency. If Ferdinand was to remarry, They needed new methods to soften the brutal realities of intimacy. In secret workshops, doctors and craftsmen devised increasingly elaborate contraptions, metal and leather aids, padded devices, and experimental surgical techniques meant to reshape his anatomy. The Palace of Madrid had become a theater of medical horror, where desperation bred inventions that blurred the line between science and torture. But no instrument could cure Ferdinand's soul. The trauma of his first marriage, combined with his lifelong shame, hardened him into something darker than insecure. He became incapable of empathy, incapable of love. He no longer saw people as human beings, but as objects, tools to be used for his own pleasure, or obstacles to be crushed beneath his will. Maria Antonia, in his mind, had simply been a tool that failed. His subjects were tools to maintain power. Anyone who questioned him was an obstacle destined for elimination. His cruelty began to leak into daily life. Servants who displeased him were not just dismissed, but often disappeared altogether. Guards who failed to keep absolute secrecy about the royal chambers were exiled to the empire's most dangerous frontiers, where death was certain. Even minor offenses such as glimpsing his naked body could lead to flogging, exile, or worse. Paranoia consumed him. He was obsessed with the idea that people mocked him behind his back. And though there was truth in it, the whole of Europe whispered about the Spanish embarrassment. His reaction grew violent and unhinged. He kept secret lists of those he suspected of laughter, planning elaborate revenge for the day he would hold true power. By 1807, Ferdinand's paranoia had woven itself into politics. He became the nucleus of a shadowy movement of nobles and military officers, men who despised Charles IV and his minister, Manuel de Godoy. They saw in Ferdinand a weapon to overthrow weakness with strength. They called themselves the Fernandinos, and they spread glowing propaganda. They called him El Deseado, the Desired One, praising his patriotism, his intelligence, his promise to restore Spain's greatness. But behind the mask of the Desired One was a broken man, consumed by rage, haunted by humiliation, and driven by cruelty. The conspirators saw only a figurehead. What they failed to see was that Ferdinand's dysfunction had already become something worse, a disorder of the soul that would one day consume Spain itself. Their conspiracy reached its climax in October 1807, with what history would call the Escorial Conspiracy. Ferdinand was caught plotting the unthinkable, an attempt to overthrow his own father, in secret alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte. When the plot unraveled, his response revealed everything about his character: cowardice, treachery, and a man who had never known loyalty, not even to his blood. When Ferdinand's conspiracy was exposed, his reaction shocked even his closest allies. Instead of standing with the men who had risked everything for him, he turned on them instantly. He gave full confessions, revealed every detail of their plans, named every conspirator, and threw himself at his parents' mercy, begging for forgiveness. While his allies were dragged off to prison or exile, Ferdinand walked away untouched. This moment set the pattern for his life. He would use people until they were no longer useful, then discard or destroy them without hesitation. But as his political treachery unfolded, another torment deepened: the grotesque progression of his body. Court physicians whispered that his anatomy was changing shape, becoming ever more misshapen, making intimacy nearly impossible. Some later suggested he suffered from a rare condition called megaloas, a disorder where growth continued unnaturally into adulthood. Whether true or not, the practical consequences were undeniable. Ferdinand needed wives who could be controlled or coerced, and elaborate devices to make what should have been natural acts even remotely possible. Deep within the palace, craftsmen became unwilling accomplices in his nightmare. Their secret workshops looked less like royal chambers and more like laboratories of cruelty, part medical clinic, part torture chamber. They built padded contraptions, restraining harnesses, and bizarre implements meant to minimize the injury Ferdinand inflicted during his encounters. These artisans lived under the king's threats, their silence bought with money and enforced by fear. When several were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, Few doubted whose hand had silenced them. Then came the invasion of 1808. Napoleon's armies marched into Spain, and Ferdinand, stripped of his crown, found himself a captive rather than a king. His humiliation was doubled by the knowledge that his most intimate secret was no secret at all. French intelligence had detailed records of his condition, and in captivity, French doctors studied him like a specimen. Freed from the cautious deference of Spanish physicians, they conducted examinations that were as merciless as they were thorough. The reports they left behind, buried for centuries in Napoleonic archives, read like a grotesque anatomy of myth. They described a body deformed beyond recognition, a sexual organ swollen and distorted until it seemed less human than monstrous. The physicians speculated it was the result of colliding genetic disorders, a perfect storm of dysfunction that had cursed a man born to rule. And yet, while Ferdinand was prodded, dissected, and humiliated in the Château de Valençay, men in Spain fought and died in his name. Noblemen and soldiers spilled their blood in the mountains and trenches, believing they were fighting for a savior. The irony was cruel. While patriots sacrificed their lives, their king spent his exile obsessively drafting letters to Europe's courts, seeking brides who might endure his condition long enough to secure an heir for his cursed dynasty. During his exile, Ferdinand wrote countless letters to Europe's royal courts. They were not letters of strategy or gratitude for the sacrifices being made in his name, but pathetic appeals for brides who might endure his special circumstances. Page after page revealed a man utterly disconnected from the agony of his people. While Spain bled and burned under war, Ferdinand's greatest concern was his next wedding night. When he finally returned to Spain in 1814, the nation erupted in joy. The welcome was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Crowds surged into the streets, weeping with relief, throwing flowers before his carriage. Mothers lifted their children high to see the king their fathers had died to restore. The air itself seemed to tremble with celebration. Madrid's stones echoed with chants of El Deseado, the desired one. Ferdinand smiled, waving graciously, but his thoughts were not with the cheering masses. His first priority was not to heal a broken nation, nor to reward the heroes who had fought in his name. His mind returned, as it always did, to the bedchamber. He wanted a new wife. He wanted an heir. Thus began what history would call the ominous decade. Its darkness lay not only in Ferdinand's political tyranny, but also in his desperate, grotesque quest to overcome his private affliction. His sexual dysfunction and his rule became inseparable, entwined like a curse. A king's inadequacy was shaping a nation's tragedy. His very first act as a restored monarch was not to pass laws or reform governance, but to commission new marital devices. He dispatched agents across Europe, Germany, Italy, even the Ottoman Empire, searching for craftsmen who specialized in forbidden instruments of royal intimacy. What they delivered to Madrid was a hidden arsenal of mechanical ingenuity, stored deep in the palace. Cushions, restraints, and contraptions that belonged as much to a dungeon as a marriage chamber. In 1816, he married Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the endless cycle of dynastic inbreeding. She was only 19, with wide, hopeful eyes, believing, perhaps naively, that duty would lead to love. Her ladies had been instructed in special preparations for the wedding night, but no warnings could have prepared her for the horror awaiting her. The wedding itself dazzled with Baroque splendor. Ferdinand stood at the altar in cloth of gold, his face calm, but his mind restless. For days, he had consulted physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious Ottoman expert smuggled into Madrid under the cover of night. All of it, every desperate measure, was meant for one night. And still, the wedding night was a catastrophe. Despite all the contrivances, nothing could conceal Ferdinand's deformity. The screams that echoed through the palace were not of passion, but of terror. Servants found shattered furniture, blood-soaked linens, and a queen trembling in silence. Maria Isabel was never the same. She developed a stutter, her voice breaking whenever she spoke in her husband's presence. She recoiled from his touch, her hands shaking, her body haunted by invisible wounds. At night she woke screaming, whispering of a monster in her chambers. Her ladies whispered of trauma, though in their time it was called hysteria. Ferdinand, rather than facing his wife's suffering, saw only insult. He convinced himself that her fear was an act of treachery, that whispers about him had reached foreign courts through her letters. His paranoia swelled like a poison. Soon every word she wrote, every glance she gave was intercepted, censored, and twisted in his mind into proof of conspiracy. Every meal Isabel touched was first tasted for poison. Every letter she wrote intercepted, and every corner of her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. Ferdinand's private torment had metastasized into a political madness, poisoning not only his marriage, but his entire kingdom. The desperate quest for an heir consumed both the royal couple and the Spanish court. Ferdinand turned the palace into a grotesque laboratory. He summoned physicians, anatomists, and even circus performers, who boasted of expertise in unusual human bodies. The royal bedchamber, once the most sacred place in monarchy, became a theater of humiliation. One account, preserved in the secret diary of a palace physician, described the most disturbing chapter of all. In his desperation, Ferdinand allowed foreign experts, German anatomists, French physicians, to watch his marital attempts. They recorded notes, sketched diagrams, and later circulated them among medical schools across Europe. The King of Spain had reduced his marriage bed to a spectacle of failure, his shame studied as anatomy rather than royalty. Isabel, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic experiments, began to collapse. She no longer ate. Her body wasted away until she was a shadow, drifting through the palace halls, her eyes hollow, her presence ghost-like. Servants said her 1,000-yard stare was more chilling than her screams had ever been. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's failures echoed far beyond the palace walls. In the Americas, colonies already in revolt seized upon his condition as proof of divine judgment against Bourbon rule. Pamphlets and posters mocked him as both impotent and tyrannical, declaring that a man who could not produce an heir could not govern an empire. His personal humiliation became propaganda that fueled revolutions from Mexico to Argentina. His response was as brutal as it was paranoid. He unleashed purges against anyone suspected of mocking his condition or supporting colonial independence. The Inquisition, restored under his reign, began prosecuting citizens for sexual slander against the crown. In this atmosphere, even whispers between husband and wife could mean imprisonment or death. Inside the palace, Ferdinand's obsession with secrecy reached grotesque extremes. He ordered hidden passageways built so he could move between his chambers and Isabel's unseen. Mirrors were fixed at odd angles to catch spies, while informants prowled the palace corridors, their only duty to listen for gossip about the royal bed. Isabel's health declined rapidly under this reign of terror. Physicians recorded her suffering phantom pregnancies, moments when her body imitated signs of childbearing, despite conception being impossible. Each false hope sent Ferdinand into frantic prayers, pacing outside her chamber, begging heaven to undo nature. But when the truth came, his hope collapsed into despair. These episodes paralyzed Spain's government for weeks at a time, leaving a nation leaderless while its king sulked in misery. By 1818, after 2 years of torment, Isabel's body and spirit were broken. She had endured humiliation, violence, and a prison built of mirrors and fear. What followed was her final escape from both Ferdinand and the waking nightmare of her marriage. Isabel's escape came only through the one path left open to royal women of her age: death. Officially, the court physicians recorded it as nervous exhaustion, a gentle phrase meant to hide the truth. Yet private letters from palace staff whispered of something darker, that Isabel may have hastened her own end through quiet, deliberate acts of self-destruction. Her confessor swore that her final words were not of despair, but of relief. With a trembling voice, she had prayed her gratitude for the liberation that death promised. Ferdinand's reaction to her passing revealed the depth of his unraveling mind. He did not mourn his young wife. Instead, he became consumed by the belief that she had been murdered by conspirators who sought to prevent him from producing an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, searching obsessively for traces of poison. He had Isabel's ladies-in-waiting arrested and interrogated, convinced they were part of some grand plot. His grief and paranoia fused together, creating a cycle of rage and suspicion that poisoned the palace atmosphere. The funeral itself descended into horror. Rather than honoring Isabel with dignity, Ferdinand turned her farewell into a grotesque spectacle. He demanded to view her body repeatedly as it was prepared, touching her cold skin, muttering bitterly about the wasted potential of her womb. He had a death mask made and kept it in his chambers, where visitors whispered of seeing him speak to it as though his wife still lived. But even madness could not delay his obsession with an heir. Within months of Isabel's burial, his advisors were already negotiating for a new bride. The challenge was formidable. Across Europe, Ferdinand's reputation was now infamous. His wife's tragic fates and his grotesque behaviors made him a figure of dread. Several eligible princesses quietly withdrew after consulting physicians who had served at the Spanish court. Others demanded unprecedented protections, separate chambers, personal guards, and guarantees of safety. Spain's throne, once a prize, was now considered a sentence. Finally, desperation and money overcame fear. The Saxon royal family, weighed down by financial troubles, agreed to send their daughter, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. At 24, she was older than Isabel had been, more worldly, and better prepared for the ordeal that awaited her. She arrived in Madrid in 1819 with dignity, but also with a shadowed awareness of what lay ahead. The third wedding was subdued, stripped of grandeur. The Spanish court, weary of repeated disasters, celebrated with restraint. Few foreign dignitaries attended. The air carried not excitement, but resignation, as though everyone already knew how this story would end. Maria Josepha approached her role with a cold, clinical determination. She had been thoroughly briefed by Saxon physicians, who armed her with medical devices, preparations, and even her own personal doctor, who specialized in difficult marital circumstances. To her, marriage was not romance, but a medical experiment. Each night's duties were conducted like surgical procedures, measured, timed, and supervised. She kept meticulous records of these attempts at intimacy, noting times, methods, and outcomes with the detached precision of a scientist. For Ferdinand, this new approach was a torment of its own. Isabel's fear had wounded him, but Maria Josepha's composure enraged him. To be treated not as a husband, but as a specimen under examination, only deepened his sense of humiliation. The cycle of failure began again, cloaked now not in terror, but in cold precision. And with each passing attempt, the king's rage grew darker, his paranoia sharper, and his hope more fragile. Ferdinand's paranoia soon swallowed Maria Josepha as well. He became convinced that she was secretly documenting his failures and sending reports to foreign intelligence services. His spies told him of her frequent letters to Saxon physicians. Correspondence, Ferdinand believed, was not about her health, but about betraying state secrets of his anatomy. Meanwhile, Spain itself continued to crumble. The American colonies had broken away one by one, stripping the empire of the wealth that had sustained it for centuries. The king's obsession with his dysfunction left him incapable of facing the political and economic collapse at hand. Cabinet meetings were delayed when he quarreled with his wife. Crucial decisions were postponed for weeks, while he tested new techniques with his physicians. The Spanish people, who had once welcomed his return, began to grasp the true cost of their monarch. Revolution stirred in the cities, bandits claimed the countryside, and famine hollowed the faces of his subjects. Yet Ferdinand poured the treasury into sexual contraptions and foreign medical consultants. Across Europe, Spain became a laughingstock, its decline embodied by a king whose most private humiliations had become a matter of public record. Then, in 1829, after 10 years of cold, clinical matrimony, Maria Josefa achieved what seemed impossible. She was pregnant. The news struck the court like lightning. Across Europe, diplomats speculated breathlessly. Had Ferdinand triumphed over his own body? Was this a miracle, a triumph of science, or something far more scandalous? An heir conceived by another man. Ferdinand's reaction was delirious, a feverish blend of euphoria and dread. He placed Maria Josefa under guard, summoned physicians from across the continent, and had priests bless her chambers daily. His obsession with protecting the unborn child bordered on madness. He convinced himself that invisible enemies would strike at his miracle heir through poisons, sorcery, or blasphemous science. For months, the pregnancy gave him a fragile joy. But at 7 months, disaster came. Maria Josefa began to bleed, her condition worsening with each passing day. Modern medicine would recognize it as placental abruption, deadly, but survivable with proper care. Yet Ferdinand sabotaged her chances. He flooded her chambers with mystics, alchemists, and priests, forcing physicians to work under chaos and contradiction. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josefa went into premature labor. The delivery became a nightmare. Ferdinand, ignoring all pleas, insisted on personally supervising the scene. His untrained presence only deepened the horror. The child, a fragile daughter, lived for only a few hours before slipping away. Maria Josefa survived the birth, but never regained her strength. 3 weeks later, weakened by infection and despair, she too died. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the final collapse of his sanity. He refused burial, demanding that physicians continue trying to revive mother and child. For nearly a week, the palace reeked of decay as the king ordered grotesque experiments in resurrection. Only when the corpses began to rot beyond denial did he finally relent. Afterward, he sank into a despair so profound that courtiers feared he would starve himself to death. He shut out advisors, ignored the affairs of state, and spent his days in darkness, staring at the death masks of his wife and infant daughter, silent reminders of his failures as a man, a husband, and a king. The palace walls were lined with death masks, one for each of Ferdinand's wives. He moved through the corridors like a ghost, a man entombed in his own madness, while Spain itself fell into ruin around him. But fate was not yet finished with him. In 1829, at the age of 45, Ferdinand, who had spent his entire adult life failing to produce a living heir, found himself preparing for a fourth marriage. His advisors, desperate to salvage the monarchy from collapse, arranged a union with Maria Cristina of Naples. What they concealed from him until after the negotiations was a secret that mocked the very foundation of his obsession. Maria Cristina was already pregnant when she arrived in Madrid. The wedding was a spectacle of hypocrisy, conducted in 1829 with grim ceremony. Maria Cristina walked down the aisle visibly carrying another man's child. Yet Ferdinand accepted the humiliation with desperate eagerness. He convinced himself that divine providence had finally intervened, that heaven itself had given him an heir by unconventional means. When Isabella II was born in 1830, the court celebrated her as the long-awaited continuation of the Bourbon line. But for Ferdinand, the child was both a blessing and a curse. He knew the truth, that she was not of his blood. Yet to protect the dynasty, he clung to the fiction of legitimacy, forcing himself to believe in the lie. His marriage to Maria Cristina became a theater of deceit. She feigned respect, while he feigned certainty that Isabella was his. Still, his obsession never died. Even as age hollowed his body, Ferdinand pursued intimacy with Maria Cristina, desperate to father a child of his own. Physicians, midwives, and so-called specialists crowded the royal bedchamber once again, watching as his failures grew more pitiful with time. What had once been grotesque now became tragic, an emperor clawing at the impossible as the empire slipped from his grasp. But his final years were defined not by longing, but by paranoia. Ferdinand's suspicion of Maria Cristina grew to monstrous proportions. He conducted midnight raids on her chambers, storming in with armed guards in search of imagined conspiracies. Her ladies-in-waiting lived in terror of these sudden invasions, never knowing when the king's wild eyes would blaze upon them, spitting accusations of treachery. His madness reached even darker depths. He had peepholes drilled into the walls, crude openings that allowed him to spy on his wife like a deranged voyeur. Servants whispered of seeing his eye fixed to these holes, watching Maria Cristina in her most private moments, while she prayed, while she nursed their child, even while she sat silently in reflection. She began to move through her own rooms like a prisoner, rehearsing every gesture, every word, every glance, knowing she was always being watched. The rituals of food tasting became grotesque ceremonies of suspicion. Ferdinand decreed that every dish must be sampled by servants, who were then forced to wait 30 minutes before the meal could be served in case of slow-acting poison. He studied their faces with hawk-like intensity, searching for any tremor of illness. Several tasters collapsed from exhaustion and fear, which only confirmed his darkest fears of endless assassination plots. Maria Cristina, caught in this suffocating web, began to unravel just as Ferdinand's other wives had. Her intercepted letters to Naples revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity. She wrote of living under constant surveillance, of trembling at shadows, of doubting even her own thoughts. The same sickness that had haunted Isabel and Maria Josepha had now crept into her heart, the madness of being bound to a man who was both her husband and her captor. Even her own servants watched her with suspicion. The queen often described her life as if she were trapped inside a glass cage, every breath measured and monitored for signs of rebellion. The king's paranoia had seeped into every corner of the palace, poisoning the air like a slow-acting venom. He rotated his personal guards daily, terrified that familiarity might breed corruption by enemy hands. Cabinet ministers endured loyalty tests so absurd, they bordered on madness. Ferdinand would deliberately contradict himself in private meetings, waiting to see if any minister dared correct him. A single word of disagreement, no matter how minor, was treated as treason. The Spanish court, once celebrated as the crown jewel of European elegance and cultural refinement, decayed into a grotesque theater of suspicion. Courtiers learned to speak in riddles, avoiding direct eye contact with the king, their movements as cautious as spies in hostile territory. Conversations dwindled into whispers, and friendships dissolved overnight if loyalty was questioned. Everyone knew that a misplaced word, even spoken in jest, could mean exile, or worse. Ferdinand's paranoia even infected his relationship with his infant daughter, Isabella. He both adored her as his heir and despised her as living proof of his deepest humiliation. Though he knew she was not his biological child, he spent hours studying her face, searching for any resemblance to himself, or to his wife's rumored lovers. He ordered artists to paint Isabella at every stage of infancy, comparing each portrait against images of himself and Maria Cristina's former companions. The cruel irony haunted him. Spain's succession was secure only because he had failed in the most personal way. His inability to father an heir had paradoxically ensured the survival of his dynasty. What should have been his triumph instead corroded his heart, leaving every moment of affection with Isabella poisoned by bitterness. Desperate, Ferdinand summoned genealogists and physicians, demanding proof of Isabella's legitimacy. These experts, well aware of the peril they faced, wrote carefully ambiguous reports, crafted to support whichever conclusion the king chose that day. Their words, preserved in palace archives, read less like science and more like survival manuals, evidence of scholars trapped in an impossible task. His obsession with control grew unbearable for Maria Cristina. Her letters were monitored by servants, who were ordered not only to copy the content, but to record the expressions on her face, while she wrote. Ferdinand demanded precise reports of her every movement, how long she prayed, which books she read, even who she looked at during court appearances. Yet the queen endured. She mastered the art of composure, presenting to the world a serene, untouchable figure, while privately struggling under the crushing weight of constant surveillance. Centuries later, her hidden diary was discovered behind a false wall in her chambers. In it, she confessed that she felt like an actress who must never break character, not even in my dreams. But Ferdinand's madness did not remain contained within the palace walls. Foreign ambassadors reported his erratic behavior to their courts, warning that Spain itself had become unstable. Marriage negotiations faltered, alliances crumbled, and questions spread across Europe. Could Spain, under such a king, be trusted at all? The palace walls were lined with death masks, one for each of Ferdinand's wives. He moved through the corridors like a ghost, a man entombed in his own madness, while Spain itself fell into ruin around him. But fate was not yet finished with him. In 1829, at the age of 45, Ferdinand, who had spent his entire adult life failing to produce a living heir, found himself preparing for a fourth marriage. His advisors, desperate to salvage the monarchy from collapse, arranged a union with Maria Cristina of Naples. What they concealed from him until after the negotiations was a secret that mocked the very foundation of his obsession. Maria Cristina was already pregnant when she arrived in Madrid. The wedding was a spectacle of hypocrisy, conducted in 1829 with grim ceremony. Maria Cristina walked down the aisle visibly carrying another man's child. Yet Ferdinand accepted the humiliation with desperate eagerness. He convinced himself that divine providence had finally intervened, that heaven itself had given him an heir by unconventional means. When Isabella II was born in 1830, the court celebrated her as the long-awaited continuation of the Bourbon line. But for Ferdinand, the child was both a blessing and a curse. He knew the truth, that she was not of his blood. Yet to protect the dynasty, he clung to the fiction of legitimacy, forcing himself to believe in the lie. His marriage to Maria Cristina became a theater of deceit. She feigned respect, while he feigned certainty that Isabella was his. Still, his obsession never died. Even as age hollowed his body, Ferdinand pursued intimacy with Maria Cristina, desperate to father a child of his own. Physicians, midwives, and so-called specialists crowded the royal bedchamber once again, watching as his failures grew more pitiful with time. What had once been grotesque now became tragic, an emperor clawing at the impossible as the empire slipped from his grasp. But his final years were defined not by longing, but by paranoia. Ferdinand's suspicion of Maria Cristina grew to monstrous proportions. He conducted midnight raids on her chambers, storming in with armed guards in search of imagined conspiracies. Her ladies-in-waiting lived in terror of these sudden invasions, never knowing when the king's wild eyes would blaze upon them, spitting accusations of treachery. His madness reached even darker depths. He had peepholes drilled into the walls, crude openings that allowed him to spy on his wife like a deranged voyeur. Servants whispered of seeing his eye fixed to these holes, watching Maria Cristina in her most private moments, while she prayed, while she nursed their child, even while she sat silently in reflection. She began to move through her own rooms like a prisoner, rehearsing every gesture, every word, every glance, knowing she was always being watched. The rituals of food tasting became grotesque ceremonies of suspicion. Ferdinand decreed that every dish must be sampled by servants, who were then forced to wait 30 minutes before the meal could be served in case of slow-acting poison. He studied their faces with hawk-like intensity, searching for any tremor of illness. Several tasters collapsed from exhaustion and fear, which only confirmed his darkest fears of endless assassination plots. Maria Cristina, caught in this suffocating web, began to unravel just as Ferdinand's other wives had. Her intercepted letters to Naples revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity. She wrote of living under constant surveillance, of trembling at shadows, of doubting even her own thoughts. The same sickness that had haunted Isabel and Maria Josepha had now crept into her heart, the madness of being bound to a man who was both her husband and her captor. The royal chambers grew heavy with an atmosphere that clung to the walls like incense, suffocating and impossible to escape. From this very room, Ferdinand held his audiences, issuing royal commands while surrounded by silent reminders of his deepest failures. Every council meeting, every diplomatic conversation unfolded under the shadow of his broken body and restless mind. For Queen Maria Cristina, the pressure became unbearable. Ferdinand's behavior, once erratic, was now openly deranged. She began to wither under the strain. Her hair thinned, her weight shifted alarmingly, and tremors shook her hands when she tried to maintain her composure in public. Even in the safety of her chambers, her ladies-in-waiting noticed her new compulsions. The nervous glance over her shoulder, the sharp start at every sudden sound, the restless twisting of her fingers. Ferdinand's paranoia reached its most grotesque form in 1832. Convinced that Maria Cristina was plotting to poison him through touch, he demanded humiliating medical examinations before he would permit even the smallest gesture of intimacy. Court physicians, summoned like guards, examined the queen's body in his presence, searching for imagined toxins. The degradation was total. Whatever remained of their marriage crumbled into dust beneath his delusions. Across Europe, the world watched Spain with a mixture of horror and fascination. Diplomatic letters whispered of a kingdom collapsing under the weight of one man's madness. Some foreign powers, recognizing the instability, quietly fueled regional independence movements, believing that a fractured Spain was safer than one ruled by a monarch so clearly unhinged. By 1833, Ferdinand's own body began to betray him as much as his mind had. A trembling hand, chronic pain in his stomach, and the cloud of confusion that dulled his speeches revealed a king sliding into ruin. His addresses to the court became wild tangles of accusations and conspiracies spun from shadows, enemies that lived only in his imagination. And then, almost quietly, came the end. The years of agony, suspicion, and dysfunction simply ground him down. Ferdinand drifted between moments of lucidity and feverish delirium, calling out for wives long dead, commanding investigations into plots that had never existed. At last, his body gave way to exhaustion, and death claimed him in 1833. Officially, the cause was listed as gout. In truth, his physicians admitted he had died of something greater: exhaustion of the body, exhaustion of the spirit, exhaustion of a man consumed by desire he could never fulfill and fears he could never silence. The autopsy, conducted in secrecy by those same physicians, revealed the cruel truth of his lifelong torment. His anatomy, infamous in rumor, was preserved, an organ grotesquely oversized, marked by scars and deformities that made normal function impossible. The discovery confirmed decades of whispered speculation. But what the physicians also found was darker still. Evidence of deliberate self-harm scarred his body, proof of desperate attempts at self-surgery begun in youth. In solitude, armed with crude tools and hopeless determination, he had tried to fix himself, only deepening his wounds, physically and psychologically. The king's preserved remains, along with detailed sketches and notes, were sealed away in the Vatican archives, hidden from the world. There, in silence, lies the final testimony of a monarch destroyed by the war between his own body and his crown. The archives declared the material too disturbing, too politically sensitive to ever be revealed to the public. What lay hidden became one of history's strangest state secrets. A few scholars who were granted access described the documents as both mesmerizing and horrifying, a window into the private hell of absolute power, warped by a man's own anatomy. Ferdinand's death marked not just the passing of a king, but the collapse of an era. His daughter, Isabella II, whose very legitimacy was shrouded in whispers, took the throne of a broken kingdom. Spain was torn apart by civil war, crippled by economic ruin, and disgraced on the international stage. The once mighty empire that had dominated the world was reduced to a minor power, its downfall accelerated by decades of misrule under a king whose personal obsessions eclipsed his duty. The story of Ferdinand is a chilling reminder. Power without wisdom is dangerous, but power chained to personal dysfunction is catastrophic. His reign was proof that one man's private shame can erupt into public disaster, and that the fragile body of a single ruler can determine the fate of millions. His 3 dead wives, his questionable heir, his terrorized subjects, and his ruined nation all paid the price for a genetic curse set in motion centuries before. Ferdinand was both the architect and the victim of this tragedy. As the royal physician in 1834 completed the grim duty of preserving the king's anatomical remains, he must have understood the terrible irony. The organ he sealed away was more than a medical oddity. It was the symbol of a reign that consumed everything it touched: wives, children, subjects, and finally, the king himself. Ferdinand sought immortality, but not the kind he received. History did not remember him as a great monarch or a wise ruler, but as a warning. His anatomical legacy, still hidden in Vatican vaults, whispers that some truths are too grotesque for legend to embrace, too human for myth to exalt, and too tragic for time to heal. The silk sheets that once hid his deformed body now covered a kingdom equally disfigured, equally incapable of functioning as nature intended. Ferdinand had finally found peace in death, but Spain would spend generations wrestling with the intimate disasters of his rule. In the end, he became immortal, but only as the most perverse king history had ever known. A man whose every breath left scars on those forced to live beneath his shadow.